3,000 years ago, the prophet Moses walked up this mountain, Mount Nebo in modern-day Jordan, and I imagine him sitting down and looking across the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley at the promised land on the other side. Moses is one of the most interesting characters in the history of the world. He wrote about his family, he wrote about his tribe, he wrote about the history of his people. In fact, he wrote about the history of the world as he knew it. The modern science of archaeology can tell us all kinds of things about the events that Moses wrote about. But sometimes it challenges our understanding. We're going to look at the science of archaeology with Dr. Randy Yonker of Andrews University. We're going to examine some of those things about archaeology that challenge our understanding of what Moses wrote. And then we're going to look at ways in which archaeology can in fact inform our understanding of his writings.
So we're cruising along the edge of biblical Moabite land. The Moabites lived here, we think, according to the Bible, they were here during the time of the Exodus when the Israelites came up from Egypt. They were forced to actually travel up the same highway heading north, the desert highway, because the Edomites to the south around Petra, the Moabites right in this area, and of course the Ammonites, they did not want the Israelites marching through their land over here to the west, so the Israelites had to go around their kingdoms and come out here to the edge of the desert highway. A lot of ancient copper mines, that was very important also in biblical times. A lot of mining, not only does it go on today, but it went on in antiquity as well. And of course, my belief is at times camels were probably used to transport some of those ores, but that's what we're exploring, what some of the debate is about exactly when were camels used extensively in this part of the world. When I went into archaeology, my first excavation was in Israel. And then around 1992, they asked me to excavate Tel Jalul, which is just to the east of the biblical town of Madaba. And we've been working there now for over 23 years. There's a large tell you can see up to the north here. That's the highest part, not only of this immediate area, but for miles or kilometers around. Everyone can see Jalul. We believe that it was probably ancient biblical Bezer, B-E-Z-E-R, mentioned in the book of Judges, as one of the Levitical cities. A tell itself is actually just a sequence of what we call occupational levels, sort of like a cake. It's got a series of buried villages or cities, one on top of the other, and over the centuries it builds up to quite a good height. So what we do is come to the site, we start at the top and sort of excavate the cake backwards. The most recent stuff is at the top of the tell. The deeper we dig, the older the remains are. This is where the ancient water system from the Iron Age was located. So we've been excavating the edge of it. The water system's actually full of water right now because of the recent rains, the winter rains here in Jordan. But underneath this water, and you can see over in that area there's a plastered reservoir that contained the water, or kept the water for the ancient people. So we're exploring that right now. In this field, the earliest building we found turned out to date, according to the pottery, to the 13th, 12th century BC. That'd be about the time the Israelites were settling in the land of Reuben after their initial conquest of the area. And we found a typical 4-room Israelite house. After the Israelites were kicked out by the Moabites, who probably lived here for a short period of time, the Ammonites took over. And we know that because we found pottery, figurines, and even some inscriptions that definitely have Ammonite writing on them. In the floor of the Ammonite period house, there's a large cave down there. And in that cave we found over 20 bodies. Maybe they were Ammonites that were killed in some kind of a warfare. There were women, there were children, not too many adult men. Maybe there was a disease, but anyway, they threw all the bodies in there unceremoniously, and then the hole was covered up until we excavated it. One summer, I had finished my master's degree in biology, and I was in Sacramento. I wasn't taking teacher education classes. I actually had a strange summer with nothing to do. And I discovered that they were teaching at the local university, California State University, Sacramento campus. They were teaching a couple of courses in archaeology, and I thought, why don't I do something for fun, while I'm deciding what to do with my graduate training for the future. And I decided to sign up for these two classes. One was called Biblical Archaeology, and the second one was Egyptology. And I thought those would both be interesting as well as beneficial for understanding, the archaeological background for the biblical story. I was surprised they would actually teach a course called Biblical Archaeology at the State University, because typically, the secular world is a bit more skeptical. At California State University, Sacramento, I signed up for these two courses, and it was in the first course. They were meeting different days of the week during the summer session, and the first course, I think I met twice a week, as I remember, in the evening, and it was Biblical Archaeology. And the professor at that time, he was an anthropology professor, an archaeologist. He had experience in biblical archaeology, but he had been trained in the typical historical critical methodology, and he had grave doubts about the historicity of a lot of the Bible. And I remember on the very first evening, he gave several examples of why we as scholars, young scholars, had to be careful not to take the Bible too seriously or not take its statements as historical. Was the presence of anachronisms in the early biblical stories, things that are out of time. An anachronism would be like saying George Washington drove in an automobile, in which we know there weren't cars in George Washington's time. So the idea that there were domesticated camels in the time of Abraham was an example of one of these anachronisms. Professor Goldfried pointed out that according to archaeological research, camels were not domesticated until about 1200 or 1000 BC, 1,000 years before the time of Christ. And of course, according to traditional biblical chronology, Abraham would have lived several centuries before that time. Some people would date Abraham to maybe 1,800 years before the time of Christ. Others push him back as early as 2,000 or even 2,200 years before the time of Christ. So you're talking about Abraham having camels like 1,000, 1,200 years before camels are said to have been domesticated. And so Dr. Goldfried said that shows you why the Bible's statements can't be trusted historically. There's too many anachronisms like this. Clearly the story was written much later. Many of the details about Abraham, such as his having camels, were made up. They were kind of inserted into the story at a much later time. So when you think of Abraham, forget about the camels. And I remember that made an impression on me. It was a problem I never even thought of, because when anyone thinks about the Middle East, we all think of deserts and camels, and that's sort of a common assumption we have. It never occurred to me that the biblical statements on camels wouldn't be historically accurate. Just a little detail, of course, but it always impressed me, and I remember sticking that in the back of my mind, wondering how good is the evidence for that? How important is this as an issue, and so forth. But I always wondered about those camels and how good was the scientific evidence for a late domestication. And from that time on, whenever I would see an article dealing with camels in the Middle East, I would kind of put it away, I would read it and file it. And in the back of my mind, I was really wondering, what is the true story about the history of domestication? And as the years went by, I discovered it's a lot more complicated than people lead you to believe. Scholars certainly have definite attitudes, but I discovered there are many scholars that argue for a much earlier date for the domestication. Some scholars will argue, and they're not necessarily interested in the biblical story, but they'll argue that domestication had to have occurred at least by 2000 BC. That's well before most biblical critics will say. And yet there are other scholars who will say, no, the domestication was actually later than 1000 BC. So I realized there was a wide diversity of opinion, even within the scholarly world, and many of the scholars were not at all motivated by or interested in the biblical questions. So that course, the questions that Dr. Goldfried raised about the camels, the questions are always kind of in the back of my mind, and I would collect the articles and look at them, but I never really saw a good final solution, a good answer to this. Opinions were all over the place. So that was one of those questions I sort of had to put on my intellectual mental shelf and wait to see if more information would come someday that would help settle the question for me a little bit more. And eventually that would lead to this discovery that happened many years later when we were in the desert of Egypt, north of the traditional Mount Sinai, when we made this discovery of a petroglyph that seemed to be sort of a linchpin in helping understand when were camels actually domesticated.
ancient city of Petra thrived on the trade that camels allowed. Camel trains came through here with goods from all over the then known world. So we decided to come here and look at how camels worked in ancient societies.
We've just entered into one of the chambers of the famous obelisk tomb, which is near the entrance of the famous archaeological park of Petra. We went into this chamber in particular because there's a lot of petroglyphs that have been carved into the sides of this chamber's walls. For some reason in antiquity, people like to carve various animals, horses and camels and so forth. This particular chamber has quite a few camels actually. You can see how they've taken some kind of a tool and carved into the rock, leaving a light-colored amount of the rock visible. In this case, this was carved into kind of a black sooty area, and because this fire was probably lit in recent times to give heat for maybe Bedouin living in the cave, it created soot on the wall, and this was carved through that soot. So this particular camel drawing is probably a recent one, but it shows again how important camels are to the culture here in southern Jordan. We might have some slightly earlier ones over here. Again, this is a camel petroglyph. You can see the four legs down here, the long neck of the camel, the hump, and here's another one going the other direction. It doesn't look like these have any humans riding on them, so we wouldn't know that these were domesticated or not based on the context of the picture, but because we can date this from the patina and from some of the Arabic writing that's on the walls of this tomb, we know these are fairly recent. And that this would be a time when camels are definitely domesticated. But you'll see throughout Petra, this was a major hub, and camel caravans were extremely important for bringing goods all over the Middle East. A few years ago, there was a flash flood that washed out the bottom of the Seek. The actual floor of this canyon that goes into Petra was actually several meters above where I'm standing right now. But when the water washed all the mud away, they discovered the original pavement of the floor, and they also found on this wall to my right about a half a dozen large full-size camels that have been carved right into the rock. The legs are unfortunately broken, but you can see the feet. These are the back feet of the camel, the front feet of the camel. You can see the belly and his hump up there. There's another camel there and some more down that direction. And in front of the camel, leading the caravan, is a robed individual, a man, leading his camels on in. So this is a wonderful depiction of an actual camel caravan coming maybe somewhere from Saudi Arabia, maybe bringing incense in to be traded here at the Great Emporium at Petra. So I went to the University of Arizona and studied with Dr. William Deaver there, who was one of the preeminent Syro-Palestinian archaeologists at the time, and very much at the center of the biblical archaeology debate, whether there was really such a thing as biblical archaeology and what was the proper relationship between the Bible and the scientific facts that were coming out of the ground. And so it was a great privilege for me, and I learned a lot to go down to University of Arizona and study with Dr. Deaver, and in a sense he really helped launch my field career. And I really feel a sense of gratitude for how he trained me and the support that he gave me. The idea that camels were domesticated quite late can be traced back to William Foxwell Albright, a famous American biblical archaeologist. He wanted to show that the archaeological record somehow could be made compatible with the biblical story. He saw the story of Abraham coming from Mesopotamia, and he was wondering whether Abraham really would have had camels that early or not. As he read the ancient literature from Mesopotamia, he saw that there was a group of people known as the Amorites who actually traveled along the same route that the Bible says Abraham traveled along. And of course, the Bible indicates that Abraham had Amorite ancestry somehow. So Albright made this hypothesis that maybe Abraham was one of the Amorites that came across the Fertile Crescent into Palestine in one of these migrations. Since the ancient texts also indicated the Amorites had donkeys, Albright suggested that Abraham, rather than having camels, must have had donkeys. He was a donkey caravaneer, if you will. And because he was so wedded to that idea that Abraham was an Amorite with donkeys, Albright had to insist that Abraham's camels did not really exist. We're at a camel camp here in Wadi Rum, A lot of tourists today like to come down here and enjoy riding camels in the desert, but this is actually along the old route where the camel caravans during the Nabatean time, 200 years before the time of Christ, would come up from Yemen with the incense trade, come all the way up to Petra, a major node. The question is, how long have these caravans been running, these camel caravans? We're still in the Wadi Rum, but we've moved some distance now, and we're at the Anfashia inscriptions, and there's also a lot of petroglyphs on the face of this particular rock. And once again, we see that camels are prominently displayed. There's stylistic differences in these petroglyphs. Some of the camels are solid the way they're drawn, others are just sort of outlined. You can see there's a large variety of them. One thing that's unique about the petroglyphs is that you find inscriptions with the pictures, and those inscriptions actually help us date the artistic depictions of the camels. We can also see that there's a variation in the patina of some of the drawings and inscriptions. The darker patina, the more time there's been oxidizing where the rock was cut away, that typifies most of this petroglyph cliff here, but there are a few that are very light, and that would indicate they were carved much more recently. One of the most obvious, actually, is a very recent one at the top of this face here. It seems like it even says Barbara, a modern name. You can see that where the rock has been cut away, it's very, very light in color. In 1998, I was with a group of friends, scholars, even some family members, and we were visiting in the Sinai area near St. Catherine's Monastery, where the story of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God is commemorated. And I had heard that there were some early inscriptions to the north of St. Catherine's Monastery in the Wadi Nasib. These are actually Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, the earliest form of the alphabet that probably was the precursor to the Hebrew alphabet that our Bible was written in. And I wanted to see these and wanted my students with me to see them. And we took off in our four-wheel drives, and sure enough, we found the Wadi Nasib, and we found the very mountain in one of the photographs upon which the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions had been inscribed, probably at least 1500 BC. So we got out of our Jeeps, we hiked up to the mountain, to the rock where these inscriptions were supposed to be located, and sure enough, there they were. I noticed that to the left of the Proto-Sinaitic inscription was a 12th dynasty inscription from an Egyptian pharaoh, Menemes III. And so I knew that both of these inscriptions were quite old, and the patina on them indicated that they had been there for quite some time, at least 1500 BC, if not earlier. As I stepped back and started looking at the rest of the rock, and I saw something that had not appeared in the literature of earlier scholars who had visited these sites. There were petroglyphs on the rocks. And as I was looking at these petroglyphs, these picture drawings, if you will, carved into the rock, suddenly one jumped out at me. There was a camel carved into the rock. The patina indicated it was a very old petroglyph. That in itself was kind of interesting because it would indicate that that camel was drawn before 1500 BC based on the inscription. But then I saw in front of the camel and attached to the camel there was a human being. He was holding a rope and he was leading the camel, and it looked like somebody had tried to draw kind of an ancient camel caravan in the area. And that was kind of interesting because not far from these inscriptions there is a series of ancient Egyptian mines that date to the same time period. So it looked to me like someone was trying to show what it looked like for these camels to take the ore and carry it out of these mines, perhaps across the sand back to Egypt. And that made perfect sense to me, but it hit me, wow, if these are pictures of humans using camels as early as 1500 BC or even earlier, this contradicts Albright's idea that camels were not domesticated until 1200 BC. They clearly in Egypt, in this area not far from Palestine, were being used by humans at least 300 years before Albright's date, and maybe 400 or 500 years or more. We don't really know for sure. So this opened up a whole new way of thinking for me about the date of Abraham's camels. I was raised in a Christian family, but when I was young, my parents had some issues and they divorced when I was about 12 years of age. And up till that time, they'd been pretty faithful churchgoers, and that made an impact on me. My grandparents on both sides of the family were also Christians and made sure I went to church school and went to church and so forth. And I always appreciated their support and their insight and so forth. But when my parents split up, that kind of left a lot of questions for me. You know, suddenly church didn't seem so important. My parents at that time quit going to church. I was even told I didn't have to go to church. So from about the time 12, 13 on, I was pretty much on my own to make, decisions about whether I believed in God, whether I believed in Christ, whether I believed in the Bible, and so forth. But my grandparents kept encouraging me, and while I had a lot of questions, as I was going through high school and going through college, particularly in the area of evolution, a lot of my friends that I would hang out with went to the local high school, and they would tell me about the theory of evolution. And I was trying to make this all come together about what I was learning about the Bible on the one hand, and yet what science seemed to be telling me on the other hand. So this was a struggle I had all the way through my high school years. And when I went to college, I chose to go to a Christian college, Pacific Union College. My parents weren't particularly keen on the idea at the time. They didn't say no, but they weren't particularly excited about it. But I went anyway, and while I was there, I majored in 2 areas, not because I necessarily was interested in these areas for career choices, but because I was curious about whether God really existed or not. So I majored in theology, religion major technically, to explore the questions about God and what does the Bible really say about God and about Christianity. And I also majored in biology at the time because I was curious about what science had to say. And I had a lot of questions, and I was looking at the different ways science would approach reality and the way theologians would approach reality, and trying to make this all come together. So that was sort of my background, actually. I discovered that answers aren't always easy to come by, but I also discovered that science doesn't always have the answers neat and clean either. So I sort of resolved my own mind to give faith a chance. Archaeology gave me a chance to actually study some of the challenges against the Bible, look at the archaeological evidence and material and see, is the Bible completely out to lunch? Is it completely fictitious? Or are there archaeological discoveries that, I don't like to use the word prove the Bible, but are they compatible with the Bible? Is it totally unreasonable to think that there might be something to the Bible, that the Bible might have something of value, that it might even have something that's historically rooted and grounded? And my own conclusion has been, yes, there is reason to believe that the Bible writers knew what they were talking about, and there's enough there to hang your faith on, so to speak. Although to me, faith is still primarily a personal relationship with God. It's not something you get just from reasoning it out. But I do think that belief in God and belief in the biblical story can have a rational and a reasonable component.
Well, I've been fascinated by the science of archaeology. All of these amazing things from the past that tell us what has happened. I'm also fascinated by the Bible and the record of the past that it gives us. When those 2 things come together, it's truly magical. In the case of Dr. Yonker, it's interesting to me that so many scientists had not noticed those amazing camel petroglyphs, and yet his mind, prepared by his understanding of the writings of Moses, prepared him to see camel petroglyphs that others had not noticed.